exist. In a TV First, we reveal the cutting-edge technology now used by British police to join the dots and reveal new evidence in all homicide investigations.
I'm Tim Tate. I've been an investigative journalist for almost 50 years.
I'm Sam Robbins and I'm a criminal intelligence analyst. For over 20 years, I've worked alongside detectives on major murder investigations.
Together in this new series, we are going to discover the fatal mistakes which prevented the perfect murder from ever being committed. Alfred Arthur Rouse was a clever man, confident, charming. He was a veteran, some might say a hero of the First World War. But Alfred Rouse had a secret, a lethal secret. He was a shameless philanderer, bigamist, and liar. By the summer of 1931, if his double life was rapidly catching up with him.
Known as the Blazing Car murder, I think it's important to stress at the very beginning that this was an extremely brutal murder.
Alfred Rouse. What struck me is that because this is an historical case, we have an absolute cornucopia of case papers.
Yes.
What emerges is a really clear pattern, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It is an amazing thing to do, to be able to look at the historic case papers and provide a really detailed timeline of the events and people that are associated with Alfred Rouse.
So what do we know about Alfred Rouse? We've got this one surviving still of our man. What does his biography tell us?
So the tale of Alfred Rouse is one of high sexual appetite, multiple marriages and illegitimate children, and the racking up of a huge amount of debt and being chased by the mothers of the children, which then ultimately ends up in Rouse trying to plan a perfect murder in order to abscond with no trace of himself. It's like something out of an Agatha Christie story, isn't it?
This is almost a textbook example of a classic case of English murder.
Alfred Rouse was born in 1894 in London, and typical of young men at that time, left school quite early. In fact, when he was 14 years old, he started a career initially in carpentry, and he spent 5 years working for a furniture manufacturing company.
He was quite an exceptional athlete, quite good at all sports, and a very good, accomplished musician. He could play the piano, the violin, and the mandolin. In his teenage years, he became a staunch member of the Church of England and worked as a sacristan in the local church. He was a very, very well-respected, well-behaved individual.
And around 1910, when he was around 16, he met a young lady, and they very quickly formed a relationship. Obviously, in those days, it's quite common for people to form an early relationship, get married early.
Alfred meets Lily Mae Watkins in 1909, and he eventually marries her in 1914. And in that intervening time, he joins the war effort as a private and is sent to Paris, where he fathers an illegitimate child with a Parisian lady.
So he's meant to be fighting in World War I.
Yes.
and he's got his own little battles going on in some kind of hotel in Paris.
Yes, very, very much so. And this would be a repeating pattern of behaviour, you know, as we quite often see with offenders, particularly where motives are sex and money. You'll see a repeating pattern, and that one certainly plays out in the case of Alfred Rouse.
He was posted to France and had some unpleasant experiences as would be expected in the First World War, some dreadful events, which culminated in the Battle of Festubert in France.
His regiment was involved quite heavily, and it's during this experience that Alfred became really sort of a hand-to-hand combat with a German soldier, bayonet attack, and he stabbed first at the German soldier and missed, and he was waiting for that retaliatory strike back at himself, which never came. But it was an experience that sort of haunted him for the rest of his days. He'd wake up with nightmares of this almost hand-to-hand battle with his German soldier. On the last day of the Battle of Festubert, Alfred suffered severe injuries to his head and his legs and other parts of his body when a bomb exploded quite near to his head, actually, and he was invalided out. He spent a year in a military hospital. And when he went home, he found it very difficult to walk correctly. His leg wouldn't bend at the knee, and he'd complain of dizziness, have headaches. So he was really awarded quite a good pension from the army when he first returned to London.
The effect of the shrapnel, which was embedded into his head, caused some sort of personality problem to him. He became very, very talkative, apparently. He would laugh for no apparent reason during conversation. He complained of dizziness and insomnia, and he suffered with short-term memory loss. That dreadful incident in the war certainly affected him mentally.
So there's a very interesting case of a guy called Phineas Gage in psychology who suffered a very similar incident in terms of a brain injury to his frontal lobes, and he's often cited as a case of somebody who suffered a very significant brain trauma but changed his personality quite significantly. And we see this very similar kind of situation in terms of Alfred Rouse, in that he suffered an injury which to some extent really altered his personality and made him into a very different character than he'd previously been.
In terms of his personal life, everything from the surface looked rosy. He had a job, he had a house, he even had a car.
He had a very well-paying job, so he was a travelling representative for a company where he was receiving £4 a week, which, you know, back in the late 1920s, 1930s was a really decent wage. And the fact that he, you know, had his own car and had his own transport just goes to show the sort of status and the life that he was leading. But unfortunately, the balance was not in his favour in terms of that wasn't enough money to keep up with the lifestyle that he was choosing to lead privately.
Rouse had always had an eye for the ladies, but it seems that after his injury in the Great War, he became more promiscuous, and after he took a job as a travelling salesman, he travelled all over the country, meeting various ladies and having affairs with them.
At the point when he's discharged, he's a war veteran.
He is.
He's got a pension. You might look at him as a respectable war hero.
Yes.
But the reality was?
But the reality was is that there was really a secret life taking place. He commits bigamy and marries one of the ladies that he's involved with, a lady called Helen Campbell. She was only 14, so that also tells you something about his background and his willingness to have relationships with very young females.
So he's a predator, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And he will do whatever he needs to do to fulfill his sexual desire, and if that means having relationships with children, which is essentially what Helen is, then so be it. That's what he will do.
He got her pregnant within months of meeting and seducing her, and then, in what would become a familiar pattern, he abandoned her. He began an affair with Nellie Tucker, a young domestic servant.
He's married to two women at the same time. He's married to Lily and Helen. And then he begins an affair with a lady called Nellie Tucker. And in 1928, she has his baby. Now, at this point, he is juggling several relationships with several women and several children, all of whom are unknown to each other. So Nellie catches on to this, and the fact that Rouse isn't around, there's been abandonment issues in terms of he's not providing for the child that he's fathered. I thought it was quite an unusual thing to happen back then, but potentially not, is that Nellie goes to court for a maintenance order.
She asks the court to deal with the errant father.
Yes, so in order for him to financially start to supply and take care of her and her child and his child.
We often, when you put together a timeline like this, we see something which could be a tipping point. Is that where you see the tipping point?
I think essentially the tipping point comes a little bit further back here. I think it's to do with personalities and how strong the women are really in this case. And the women that Rouse potentially thinks that he's got control over are the ones that ultimately lead to his downfall. Helen, he's married her whilst being married to Lily, but Nellie, potentially Nellie being of a strong character and deciding that actually she's not going to stand for what he's peddling. I think that is definitely a tipping point, because obviously he then has to start supplying money, which he's now starting to run out of because he's got so many relationships that he's trying to juggle at the same time.
Times were hard. Obviously it was the 1930s, it was post-war Britain, First World War, and money was short.
So things were looking a bit desperate for Alfred. He wasn't earning enough money to pay the mortgage, keep his family at home in London, and support these maintenance payments. So he decided he needed to come up with a plan where he could rid himself of this pressure that was building up on him financially.
A flurry of court orders began to arrive, demanding Alfred Rouse pay support for the children he'd fathered. He realised the position he had got himself into was unsustainable. He needed to find a solution, and quickly.
He really must have thought that this was the end of the line, really, and what he wanted to do was to sort of wipe the slate clean and start again. What we see in these kind of cases is that there's a certain level of ruthlessness that people will go to in order to get out of these situations. For most people, they would face up to the consequences of what they've done.
At some point he hatches a plan. How do I get out of this ridiculous situation, all these financial pressures, etc.
This is what struck me as the next tipping point. He takes out an insurance policy.
He does, and it's a very specific one. And when we look at cases where people have potentially died in unusual circumstances, it's always a red flag if there is an insurance policy that is taken out shortly before an incident happens. That's always a massive red flag in a murder investigation. And lo and behold, Rouse takes out an insurance policy here to provide for Lily, his first wife. Which is interesting. It was Lily, but whether he felt that was the first relationship that he'd cemented and married her, and maybe that he owed it to her and he wanted her to be taken care of. But he takes out an insurance policy, and it's very specific, this insurance policy. It's should he die in a road accident.
That's a very unusual wording.
It's very unusual and very specific.
The plan that Alfred Rouse came up with was to fake his own death. But he took out this £1,000 insurance with the intention of finding someone to take his place in the death, in the car, and he would simply disappear, start a new life elsewhere where no one knew him. Eventually he would admit that his plan was to disappear up in Scotland where he was unknown and just start again.
So those kind of people who try to fake their own deaths and start a new life somewhere else, whether it's to collect insurance money or whether it's because they've got an affair that they want to continue. It clearly reflects a certain level really of fantasy, of daydreaming. They'll go through these kind of different scenarios that they want to plan out and how they think that their life will suddenly miraculously change and they can just start again. However, we know that it's very, very difficult to erase your past, and it certainly brings to light some kind of flaws really in their thinking, and it's almost this kind of fantasy belief that they have that leads to their downfall.
On your timeline, we're now at November 1930.
Yes.
So his planning is, I'm going to stage a car accident. Bear in mind the insurance policy.
Yes.
And my body is going to be found in the car.
Yes, but what's the problem with that?
You have to find a victim.
Yes.
Alfred Rouse's plan was to find a man that was similar build, similar height to himself, and get him in the car that he was going to destroy, with the intention that the insurance people would accept that he himself had died in this car accident.
We're right in the middle of the two world wars, as it were, when Britain was in pretty dire straits. Money was very difficult to earn. There were a lot of impoverished people. Of course, pubs and clubs were where people would go to sort of forget their problems, etc. Any individuals, particularly men, were often homeless or living in sheltered accommodation, etc. He was in the perfect time period to find someone that would probably be not noticed if they disappeared, or quickly forgotten if they were.
For a few days before the plan was put in place, he remembered that he's met this chap in a nearby pub that he knew didn't have any family, no friends or family, and he was very, very similar to Alfred in appearance. So he went and sought him out on the 2nd, 3rd of November, and sure enough, the chap was still sitting having a drink.
So to Rouse, he appeared the ideal victim. So he offered this chap the promise of work in Leicester, and he'd give him a lift up to Leicester so that he could then get employment.
He really has planned what he thinks is going to be the perfect murder by finding a victim that he thinks is not going to be missed. Very sadly for this individual, we know that he'd let Rouse know that there wasn't a person in the world who would care if he lived or died. So he'd almost written his own fate into that. Rouse had spotted him in terms of physical appearance, and then that had been backed up by no one was going to miss this individual.
That's one of the things that I took out of the case papers, this statement that this soon-to-be victim said to Rouse, "Governor, there's no one going to care if I live or die." And that's heartrending, isn't it?
It's really heartrending, isn't it? I think particularly, if you've gone to war and you fought for your country, essentially you return from war a hero, but not hero enough that anyone's going to miss you if you die on your homeland.
There's a date which crops up very quickly, and it's, in terms of Rouse's perfect murder planning, it's a significant date.
It is. Obviously he has to get around the fact that the victim is going to be identified as not being Alfred Rouse. So the idea of fire setting starts with Alfred. There is no more perfect a date to set a fire than the 5th of November.
He had selected the 5th of November 1930 as the night that he would carry out this attack, this murder. Bonfire night, fires are put together made out of wood or whatever materials and lit all over the country in gardens, on hillsides, beacons if you like. And traditionally fireworks are set off. This fitted well in with his plans, because when he set fire to the vehicle, people would naturally think, well, look, there's another bonfire up on the lane there, up the hill. And so the fire in the vehicle would attract no attention.
To make sure that his potential victim had no resistance, Alfred bought a bottle of whiskey in advance and sure enough, picked up the gentleman. They made their way up to, supposedly driving up from London to Leicester, and all the while this passenger was drinking whiskey, so he was quite insensible. By the time they got to Hardingstone near Northampton, he was quite drunk.
Rouse turned off the main road onto a little side road leading to the small village of Hardingstone, and he pulled up at the side of the road and told the man, who was now very drunk, he said, "I'm just getting out for a pee."
It's believed that Rouse knocked his victim unconscious with a wooden mallet that was found at the crime scene.
Rouse stuffed the man into the Morris saloon car and pushed his own wallet in the man's trousers so that if he were found, it would look as if it was Rouse in the car. He believed the man was dead.
Then, as part of the plan, which he'd thought through, he loosened the joint underneath the vehicle, the petrol pipe which feeds the carburetor from the petrol tank to the carburetor, which caused petrol to flow into the vehicle and, in fact, underneath the vehicle. He then set fire to the vehicle.
And he might have got away with it. His plan for the perfect murder might have worked.
Now, Rouse's story changed
Yes.
at various times, but what we can say with certainty is that he staged a car crash in a little lane off a little village.
Yes.
How close does he come to getting away with this?
Very close. Very close. He could have, if he'd have chosen another route, or he'd not taken the actions that he takes next, then he could have walked away. The car would have burnt to the point where everything would have been fairly difficult to identify, and he could have walked away into the sunset. Lily would have been taken care of, and his plan would have been carried out in the manner to which he thought it was going to.
But
that is not what happened.
Alfred Rouse took a match and set fire to the car with the man inside. He then picked up his briefcase and strolled off down the road away from the little village of Hardingstone. His plan for the perfect murder might have worked.
Unfortunately for Alfred, as he was walking away from the vehicle back towards the main road, two young men who had just been to a firework display about half a mile away met with him. And he turned and said to the two young men, "Oh look, there's a fire up there. Somebody's having a bit of a bonfire," to try and make light of what they could see. And what they say then is that this man, who they described, then walked off towards the main road, quite nonchalantly.
These two men then made their way over to where the fire was and realised it wasn't a bonfire, but was a car in flames.
They sent for the local police officers, and with the aid of the water from a nearby pond, they managed to douse the fire, and then they saw the charred remains of a body lying across the driver's seat and the passenger seat.
On examination of the vehicle, of course, the constable discovered lying on the front seat, sideways with his head on the driving seat, basically a charred corpse. And he described the head of the victim as almost like a burnt rugby ball.
I think Rouse had the right idea in thinking that if I set light to the car, it will burn the body beyond recognition. It will never be identified. And to that extent, it's true, because to this day, the body still hasn't been identified. There's no name to it. But unfortunately for Rouse, he left far too many clues behind that gave the police evidence to suggest that another person had been involved in that arson, and it wasn't simply Rouse laying in his own car having been burnt to death.
So inside, police can see that the fire hasn't taken as much as Rouse probably anticipated it would. There's a body in the car. It's badly burnt, but also the number plate of the vehicle hasn't completely melted. So there's a partial number plate available to the police as well.
Today, we take number plate recognition, ANPR, we take it for granted, don't we?
Yes.
This is 1930.
Yes. Yeah, I was quite surprised by this, I've got to say. Yeah, I was surprised that there was a database and it was checked, and very quickly that car was identified as belonging to Alfred Rouse.
Senior officers were involved, were called in, and the murder scene was sealed. It was then discovered by forensic examination that in fact the nut underneath the petrol tank had in fact been loosened purposely, and that was proven by a scientist, which of course allowed the petrol to ignite beneath and inside the vehicle.
This is a fascinating case from a forensic science perspective because it happened in the 1930s when forensic tests as we know them today were simply not available in the investigation. And so we have a situation where an individual is found in a burned out car, and the identification of that individual obviously is paramount to the investigation. Once an individual has been subject to a fire, then it makes identification very difficult because the things that we might rely upon, such as fingerprints or facial recognition, are no longer available. And we have to rely on the traditional identifying marks such as dental records and or any sort of surgical intervention that they may have sustained in life that leads the investigators to that individual. So we don't have the things that are available to us now, such as DNA technology, which we can apply to even samples that have been extremely degraded as a result of fire.
So although the police called in forensic experts with regards to the motor car, and they're able to see that it had been tampered with and thereby a deliberate fire rather than an accident, their attempts at identifying the victim were much less successful. They tried dental records with no luck because the gentleman who'd been picked up in the pub by Rouse didn't have anything about him which could be identified. And Rouse had obviously planted some of his own clothing and his wallet on the man when he left him in the car. So there was very, very little to police to go on. And in fact, he was never identified at the time. Although they did take the precaution before he was buried at Hardingstone Cemetery of taking a tissue sample to go into the archive.
But a post-mortem on the victim showed that there had been trauma to the head. It showed injuries, which of course was caused by Alfred striking the victim with the wooden mallet on the head. And in fact, the mallet was found nearby at the scene, thrown on the ground.
Within really a day, both the press and the police thought that they needed to find Rouse because these two chaps that were walking back to Hardingstone were able to give a description that matched Rouse, so they thought he was likely still alive and needed to get an account from him as to what had happened and how someone had come to be dead in his car and how his car caught light.
At that point, in Rouse's mind, does he still think he's got away with it?
Yes, 100%. I think he has, in order to ensure that his plan is foolproof, he leaves his wallet. So to all intents and purposes, the police have arrived, they've found this scene, they've found a body that isn't wholly identifiable but is a male, clearly of a certain age, and in the pocket they find identification belonging to Alfred Rouse, and they also been able to trace the car back to him. So the police then take the wallet to Lily, Lily Watkins, who is his first wife.
Alfred Rouse's plan had been thwarted. He planned to go from Northampton on the train to Scotland, but he realised had he been seen by two men, and they'd caught a good description of him, he realised that his idea that it was his body in the car wouldn't be believed. So he thought up on the spot almost another plan that his car had been stolen, and it was nothing to do with him, the fact it had been ended up in Northamptonshire.
This is something that criminologists recognise as a pattern. Routinely, killers who think they've committed the perfect murder sabotage their own plans by doing something foolish.
He decided to make his way back to his home at London. Going to Scotland, the people would realise it wasn't him that died in the car, and they'd be looking for Alfred Rouse. So instead, he made his way back to London. He arrived back about 6 o'clock in the morning. He'd hitched a lift back there. He came in without saying a word to his wife. He was in the house for about half an hour, and then he disappeared again.
Lily was asked at one point to identify the body of the victim, but it was felt that it was in such poor condition because it was badly burnt and charred that wouldn't be right to show a dead person of that nature, which is understandable. But she was able to identify positively Alfred's wallet, which was in the pocket of the victim, and also described the clothing worn by the victim as similar.
Rouse, true to form, couldn't resist going and seeing one of his female interests. So he travelled to Wales to see Phyllis Jenkins, who was surprised that he'd turned up without his car. And he said, it'd broken down, and he'd come by the means to come and see Phyllis in Wales. She wasn't that happy with that story. And then newspapers had started to report the fact that a male had been found burnt out in a car, and Phyllis puts two and two together and challenges Rouse and says, I think that you've staged a murder. Rouse leaves Phyllis's and he starts to head back to London, and Phyllis goes to the police and says, this newspaper article here, I think it's Alfred Rouse, and I think he's alive and well.
We're in 1930.
Yes.
You know, communications in 1930 weren't quite as they are now.
No.
And yet, by the time Rouse arrives in London, Scotland Yard's waiting for him.
Yes, I mean it's a staggeringly good piece of old school detective work. Detective work and luck in terms of obviously finding a really good witness in Phyllis, finding really good witnesses with the two males that find the car in the first place. So yes, by the time Rouse gets back to London, detectives from Scotland Yard are waiting for him.
Rouse is arrested.
He is.
And he tells the first of a number of tall stories.
Now, initially, when Rouse was arrested, he stuck to his story that his car had been stolen. But then, on arrival at the police station, he gave a different statement. He changed his story. This time he said he had been in the car. He must have realised there'd be evidence that would incriminate him of being inside the car. His wallet, for instance, was recognised as being in there. So he then said, well, actually, he had been the driver, but it had been a complete accident, and he'd panicked in disappearing. He'd given a lift to a hitchhiker.
He'd stopped in Hardingstone Lane in order to relieve himself, and as he left the car, he asked the hitchhiker that he picked up if he would refill the petrol in the car with a can full of petrol that was in the back, and he'd also given this chap a cigar to smoke.
The car had burst into flames. It was too late to do anything, and in a panic he just walked away from the scene of the crime. And he stuck with this story that it was an accidental fire for the rest of his incarceration.
Once again, what is surprising about this case is, given the timing of it, is how good the forensics were. So the forensics obviously came through and said and suggested that actually the male had been beaten, so he hadn't died standing outside the car, which was another, tall tale of Rouse's. But that actually he'd been beaten, so it was clear that the male had been beaten, which we know that Rouse had done with the mallet. And very sadly, that they could tell that the victim was alive when he set fire to the car. And it's possible to tell that, having worked jobs where exactly this scenario has happened. It's possible to know that they were alive at the time that the fire was set, because smoke is inhaled, very hot smoke is inhaled, and it damages and blackens the windpipe and down to the lungs. So that's how they know that somebody is alive when a fire has been set.
There was another piece of forensic detection which you've identified, which undermined Rouse's tall story completely.
Yes, so the story about the vehicle accidentally catching light simply wasn't true, and the vehicle, even in its bad state, had been examined, and it was clear that the fuel pipe of the car had been tampered with. So obviously by Rouse hoping that it was going to help ignite and keep the fire burning long enough to destroy any evidence that a crime had taken place.
Well, of course, by examining the vehicle, by the pathology, by the forensics, etc., by the evidence of the witnesses, the story was quickly dismantled, absolute nonsense, and he was charged with the murder of a then unknown male person.
Alfred Rouse may have tried to talk his way out of trouble, but he didn't succeed. He was charged with murder and put on remand to await his trial. Alfred Rouse's trial at Northampton Assizes in January 1931 lasted 4 days. Rouse insisted on giving evidence in his own defence. It's a mark of his arrogance that he believed even then he could talk his way out of trouble.
The trial attracted quite a bit of media attention, not least because it was a trial with an unknown victim. I think that's why it became quite well documented in the local press and certainly also the national press.
At the time he got to the trial, it was big newspaper coverage. There was a lot of big factors there. Iconography of a blazing car, photographs of that car, an unknown victim. And despite Rouse being constantly quizzed as to the identity of the man, he stuck with his story that he was a hitchhiker and he never asked the name.
I think the time he showed most nerves was when he was handed the actual carburettor from the car that the prosecution alleged had been tampered with in order to help start the fire. And with that in his hand, he did appear quite nervous.
It didn't take very long for the jury to find him guilty, and he was sentenced to be hung. And when the judge pronounced the guilty verdict, he merely said, "Please, Your Honour, I am innocent, and my appeal will prove this." Once the execution at Bedford Jail was set, Rouse seems to have had a change of heart. And although he didn't make a statement confessing his guilt, he did write a letter to a newspaper, the Daily Sketch, in which he outlined the actual events that took place on the night of the 5th of November.
Quite bizarrely, he admitted everything in the letter. He confessed all, explaining how he had planned the whole thing, planned to fake his death, claimed the £1,000 insurance, and that he had set fire to the vehicle using petrol, that he had loosened the pipe, and all these issues that were suspected at the time of his trial, he fully admitted.
And also why he never revealed the identity of the victim, because he simply said, "It never occurred to me to ask what his name was."
There was one really sad little coda to this story.
Yeah, and it's very sad actually when you think about it. So the victim, so the man who said that nobody cared if he lives or dies or goes missing, it seems that really is the case, and that he was never identified.
There was a twist to this sad little tale. 80 years after Rouse went to the scaffold, DNA techniques had come in and had advanced. At that point, there was an attempt to try and find out who this unknown victim was.
In 2012, the family of a man who'd gone missing in 1930 came forward saying this man might be our relative.
They'd always been told as they were growing up that William Briggs was Rouse's victim, and they wanted to know if the police could do anything with advances in DNA technology to try and identify the victim and show once and for all whether it was or wasn't William Briggs. By that time I'd retired from the police, so Northamptonshire Police forwarded the inquiry to me at the University of Leicester.
The thing about forensic science is that it can be applied to samples that have been taken today or decades ago. And so in any case, if material is retained, then it is amenable and available for testing further down the line.
This is an interesting case for forensic science because we're working with DNA that was deposited nearly 100 years ago now. It's stretching what we can actually do with current DNA technology. In 1930, the post-mortem of the victim was carried out by a very eminent pathologist, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, and the London Hospital Archive has a number of specimen microscope slides from Sir Bernard's post-mortems, and amongst those was a number of slides from his post-mortem of the victim of Rouse's murder. And what we want to do is extract from that cellular material in order to obtain a DNA profile. We've got a full male profile from the sample, and it was compared against the mitochondrial DNA of descendants of William Briggs, but there was no match. So the relatives, unfortunately, were no longer able to think that William Briggs had been Rouse's victim, and were left not knowing what happened to him back in 1930.
Since then, there's been a total of 8 families have come forward saying that their relative had gone missing around that time and offering DNA samples against this tissue. So although to date the man has never been identified and he lies in a grave recently rededicated in Hardingstone Cemetery, he is an unknown victim. But because this DNA sample exists in the archives, there's hope that he may one day be identified.
I think it's only right and proper that that man who lays in an unknown grave at Hardingstone Cemetery near Northampton deserves to have his name put on the tombstone.
So whether Rouse suffered from personality disorder or psychopathy is open to some debate. Certainly people who go on to kill other people have a certain level of ruthlessness that we might link with something like psychopathy. However, in my opinion, there's an underlying brain dysfunction, some physical situation that's led to him committing these crimes, and it's not necessarily just down to his personality.
Here you have an excellent example of an individual, Alfred Rouse, planning this murder down to the last detail, taking his time to think it through, pick the right victim, pick the right time, pick the right location to carry out the murder. He's thought it all through, the method, how he would do it. Up to the point of walking away from the vehicle, had it been completely destroyed, and had he disappeared, possibly it would be, we could call it a perfect murder. People would have thought, his family would have thought, his friends, poor old Alfred has died accidentally in a fire in his car.
In terms of the criminology of almost perfect murders. What does that tell you about how to commit a, quotes, perfect murder?
Oh, goodness. Is there such thing as a perfect murder? Personally, I don't think there is, for several reasons. The likelihood of you being witnessed taking some form of action that can ultimately be linked back to an offence is very strong. I think the other reason is that quite often offenders who think that they've planned an almost perfect murder don't allow for the fact that police forces are vast, and in amongst them they have people who have dealt with hundreds of murders and hundreds of cases and have the ability to take those expertise and come together as a unit to work out what has happened in an incident. And I think that gets underestimated by murderers on a regular basis.
He concocted this plan to escape from all these pressures, and he almost got away with it. If it hadn't been for the two young men that had been walking towards the blaze as he was going away and they recognised him, if he'd have made his way to Northampton Station without being seen and got his way to Scotland to live out a life unidentified, it would have been the perfect murder.